morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Southampton History Museum. This morning, we're joined by Mary Cummings, our Archivist and Research Center Manager here at the Southampton History Museum for another in our series of Southampton's 20th century influencers. Today, we're talking about Larry Rivers, and I believe we have a lot to go over, so I'm just going to kick it right over to Mary so she can get started on today's talk. If anybody has any questions during today's presentation, please feel free to submit them in either the Q&A function or the chat function here on Zoom, and I'll pop back in at the end to moderate any of the questions you might have. So enjoy, everybody, and take it away, Mary.
Okay, so I'll start my talk today on a brief personal note. When I was in high school in Southampton, we got a thrilling new next door neighbor on Little Plains Road. That's when the renowned artist Larry Rivers moved into number 92, which you see here. He moved in with his two sons and a housekeeper. It didn't take long for everyone to learn that the housekeeper, Birdie, was actually Larry's mother-in-law, recruited to tend to his children when he and his wife agreed to separate. Their understanding was that Larry would raise the children with the help of his wife's mother, who also became one of Larry's favorite models. There's Larry with Birdie. Birdie was apparently an extraordinarily unflappable woman who drew praise from the poet Frank O'Hara as, quote, a woman of infinite patience and sweetness who held together a bohemian household of such staggering complexity that it would have driven a less great woman mad. The neighbors were certainly aware of Larry's colorful reputation as a force in the New York art world and a reverent, sometimes shocking figure. I never actually met Larry, though I occasionally saw him zooming around town on his motorcycle. I caught the occasional show of his work at Bob Keene's Main Street Gallery, and I heard him practicing his saxophone late at night. He often played jazz with his friend and fellow artist Howard Kanowitz at a Watermill offshoot of the New York nightclub, the Five Spot. The Elm Tree Inn in Amagansett was another favorite venue, as was the Bluebird in Riverhead, which you see here, where he was usually the only white man in the room. The big draw at the Riverhead Bluebird was Red Lincoln's band, which invited Larry to play whenever he wanted to. I missed a lot of the action when I left home for college, but my younger sister Laura was well positioned to take advantage of our proximity to greatness. Laura and Larry's son Stephen were about the same age. You see him here in a painting by Larry. She was sometimes invited next door, where she fell in love with the Rivers dog, Bongo. She was also impressed by the bohemian lifestyle that permitted the children to eat SpaghettiOs cold out of the can and allowed a fellow artist to fill the kitchen with captured birds that had some role to play in the man's bizarre artwork. Adding to the offbeat aura of this unusual domestic arrangement was the constant parade of Larry's friends, lovers, and fans. The critic Sam Hunter wrote of Larry's penchant for, quote, generously throwing open his Southampton summer house to an endless troop of artists, poets, students, collectors, petitioners, and curiosity seekers with only the vaguest credentials. Hunter also noted that around town, Larry could be immediately identified by the flamboyant attire he favored at that time. Cowpunchers' boots, elaborately decorated shirts like this one, and hand-painted gaudy neckties. Eventually, when Bongo, this is Bongo in the photo, when Bongo became an inconvenience in the Rivers household, she was allowed to move next door and she became our dog. I was gone by then, but when, after Bertie's death, the Welsh-born Clarice Price was hired to replace her, things got even livelier. Vivacious, voluptuous, and uninhibited, Clarice was soon Larry's lover and then later his wife. To the delight of neighborhood kids, she and her friends often gathered in the river's backyard for some nude sunbathing. Thanks to gaps in the hedges, the kids got a thrilling peep show. So that's a glimpse of what it was like to live next door to Larry Rivers. Utzrock Loisek Grossberg, who will become Larry Rivers after a name change and rise to be a major force in American painting, is born in August 1923 in the Bronx. He's the first child of Sam and Shirley Grossberg, Jewish immigrants from Ukraine, who you see here. Money from his father's neighborhood hauling business has to be stretched, but there's enough to send Utzrock for piano lessons at the age of 7, so he can accompany his father on his violin. Music, not art, is the family's sole cultural pursuit, but the saxophone soon replaces the piano in young Utzrock's affections. Brilliant and precocious as a boy, he's a nervous and multi-talented young man, managing to get what he calls weird gigs, playing saxophone in third-rate jazz combos on the circuit while still a teenager. At one such gig, an MC, daunted by the unpronounceable name of the combo's saxophonist, punts and introduces him as Larry Rivers and his Mudcats. Rivers likes the sound and keeps the name. When bookings are slow, he's obliged to help his father out, which usually involves pushing a handcart through the New York garment district. For a proud professional musician, this is an embarrassment, which has him veering into doorways to avoid being recognized. In 1942, Rivers surprises everyone by enlisting in the Army Air Corps. Friends and family are shocked that the son of a Jewish socialist, raised in a neighborhood heavily populated by communists, would not at least wait to be drafted. In the characteristically half-serious voice he uses in his so-called unauthorized autobiography, co-written with Arnold Weinstein and published 50 years later, entitled What Did I Do?, he analyzes his decision to volunteer. Was it an attack of patriotism inspired by Pearl Harbor? Was it just the fact that a lot of guys were doing it? Or was it really just a desire to get out of the family home and leave the Bronx behind? As it turns out, his military career is extremely brief. When an Army doctor misinterprets a tremor in his hand and thinks it's a symptom of multiple sclerosis, he's given an honorable medical discharge and a pension for life. When the money from his military pension, with it, Rivers enrolls in New York's Juilliard School of Music to study composition for a year, while at the same time, he's still playing jazz gigs in and around New York. Juilliard, as you see it here, was still in its former location. Then when a player in the Johnny Morris Big Band is sent off to war, Larry quits Juilliard and takes his place. There he's befriended by band member Jack Freilicher and his then wife, Jane, who will introduce him to the pleasures of painting and change the course of his life. They invite Larry to join them in the idle hours between performances, which they like to spend sketching and painting. With their encouragement, Larry discovers a skill and inventiveness he had not known he possessed, an outlet for his nervy, creative energy that will rival the thrill of music making. He later explained, I had been caught up in the romance with jazz, blues, drugs, and night. Now I began to have pleasure in the daylight, which is not to suggest that he abandons all of his hipster habits. However high his stature might rise in the high-tone art world, a part of him will always be attuned to the New York jazz culture of his youth, with its abundant drugs, casual sex, and its top spot in the kingdom of cool. Rivers titled this painting Jazz Musician. Rivers wrote of meeting his first wife, Augusta Berger, seen here, in 1944 at a dance hall attached to a temple on the Grand Concourse where he was playing a gig. A courtship ensues, and when Augusta becomes pregnant, a rabbi makes it official in a ceremony held in the Rivers North Bronx apartment with music provided by Jazz Palace of Larry's. The couple moves in together with Augusta's toddler son, Joseph, later adopted by Rivers. Then on Halloween Day, 1945, Larry's son, Stephen, is born. The marriage is nearly as brief as Rivers' military career. In 1946, the couple separates, agreeing that Larry will raise the boys and Augusta's mother will join them to help, creating a rather unusual four-person household, a musician artist, his mother-in-law, his stepson, and his son. After the separation, Rivers moves into an apartment on East 21st Street, near the loft occupied by the artist Nell Blaine, seen here with an early painting. The Freilicers had introduced Larry to Blaine, whose bright, bold abstractions painted early in her career signal the bold personality of the woman who hosts and members a lively bunch of talented artists who flock to her door. She's a few years older than Larry, who's eager to learn from the depth and breadth of her knowledge and understanding of the art world. He also responds to her as a fellow rebel against convention, and they will have a close relationship. Nell introduces him to de Kooning, to the critic Clement Greenberg, and other important figures from among the crowd in the loft. And she persuades him and Jane Freilicher to enroll in Hans Hofmann's 8th Street School. Larry's still playing gigs around town, but his focus is shifting more and more towards art. Hans Hofmann, seen here, conceived his school as a place to teach young, talented artists the art of studio work, without emphasizing any single style of painting. Jane was reportedly an excellent student, not so Rivers, whose rebelliousness at being told how to develop his talent was apparently accepted by Hofmann. The concept of his school are fundamental, says Bob Hoffman, but his students are free to violate them. While Rivers wears his zoot suits to class, talks jive, and rejects most of what's being taught, Hoffman does not take umbrage, sticking to his belief that great artists don't need rules. Some of Rivers' more unforgivable behavior can certainly be attributed to his drug use, which had been on the rise for some time and no doubt contributed to the dissolution of his marriage. He admits to shooting up a few times in the bathroom at Hoffman's school, but is so terribly sick afterward that he's moved to get his drug habit under control. His sister is quoted in What Did I Do?, remarking that Larry always had an interest in danger and that his daredevil approach to life accounted for some of his high living and drug use. Bold, brilliant, and then proudly provocative, Rivers is a complex person, oblivious sometimes to the havoc that he leaves behind in his wake. David C. Levy, seen here on the right, is Rivers' friend, fellow musician, and later president and director of the Corcoran Gallery of Art. In an essay, Levy writes that, quote, discovering Larry's love of children was only one of many small revelations that helped me understand the warmth, loyalty, and occasional sentimentality that are part of the more private side of his complicated, protean, and publicly irreverent personality, close quotes. Much later, that view will be challenged when it's revealed that between 1968 and 1981, Rivers used his two daughters as the subjects of a film documenting their adolescence, showing them in the nude and interviewing them on the development of their bodies. It was roundly criticized as exploitation and abuse. Rivers spends 2 years studying under Hans Hofmann. Hofmann was very inspiring, he later told writer John Gruen, but I never understood what he was talking about. I just felt everything. What he will carry with him is Hofmann's emphasis on drawing as the foundation of all art. And he will emerge from this, his only formal painting instruction, convinced that art is the right path for his creative expression. He continues to accept gigs and sits in on sessions just about every night, but by day he's painting, struggling, as he later recalled, to find his way, uncertain of his talent or whether he's on the right track. His first paintings, small cubist-derived oils, are never shown, but he labels this painting my first sale. Then in 1948, the Museum of Modern Art mounts a retrospective of work by the French post-impressionist Pierre Ponal, whose painting Dining Room is seen here. Abstract expressionism will be the unyielding orthodoxy in American art for more than a decade to come, but Rivers, never one to follow the pack, will find inspiration for unorthodoxy in Ponal. He later recalled the Ponal show as marking a milestone in his artistic development, convincing him that modernism was not incompatible with figures. It frees him artistically, though not financially, with no guarantee that sales of his work will ever be enough to feed his family. He enrolls in the art education program at NYU to earn a teaching degree. Liberated from Abbeck's pressure, Rivers uses his new freedom to paint a series of high-keyed, impressionistic still lifes and interiors, like this one he titled Woman at Table. He shows them at the Jane Street Gallery in 1949. It's his first solo exhibition, and it's reviewed enthusiastically by Clement Greenberg, then a critic of almost unrivaled importance in the New York art world. Greenberg hails Rivers as an amazing beginner. He praises the sensuousness of Rivers' canvases and writes that he, quote, should continue his unorthodox approach and exploit further a native force that is already quite apparent in his art. In the spring of 1950, Greenberg and his co-curator, Meyer Shapiro, invite Rivers to show, along with such emerging art stars as Elaine de Kooning, Franz Klein, and Grace Hartigan, in an important new talent exhibition at the Coutts Gallery, run by Samuel Coutts, seen here. Deviating from the Abbeck's orthodoxy was a gamble, but a winning one for Rivers. Recognition of his remarkable talent has come early and burnished his reputation as a champion of avant-garde art. All the more fascinating for his connections to the anti-bourgeois world of jazz musicians and to the whole downtown culture with its druggy vibe, its sexual license, and hint of danger. Another artist might take such success as the first step on a clear path to the top. Rivers, though, has too much nervous energy to settle on a predictable groove. Instead, in 1950, he leaves the New York art scene behind to spend 8 months in Paris, where he experiments with writing poetry. His reading of the poets Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, and Kenneth Koch, all breaking new ground in poetry, has inspired him. But when he's joined in Paris by Nell Blaine, his companion here, he puts poetry aside for some good times and some guidance from his madcap but erudite friend that turns his focus back towards art. They visit museums together, and Rivers is deeply impressed by the old masters, as well as by Edouard Manet and especially Gustave Courbet. Back in New York, Rivers solidifies his friendships with the New York school poets he has admired through his reading and begins to devote his days almost exclusively to painting. At night, he pursues some of his old haunts and finds new ones. The poets introduce him to the Swiss-born experimental filmmaker Rudolf Burckhardt, who gives him a role in his 1950 movie, Mounting Tension, playing alongside John Ashbery and Jane Freilacher, as you see them here on the set. Young, good-looking, unattached, and now carrying an aura of artistic genius, Rivers pursues women with the same enthusiasm he devotes to everything else. At one time, he believes he's madly in love with Jane Freilacher, to the point where her refusal to become lover rather than friend leads to a half-hearted attempt to slit his wrists. His friends send him to recover with the Fairfield Porter family in Southampton, where Porter paints this portrait of Larry wearing a white t-shirt and bandaged wrists. How deep the wounds are to his pride or his wrists is open to question. Freilacher later dismissed the importance of Rivers' stab at self-annihilation, and even Rivers himself suggests in his book that it may have been, quote, only another of my attention-getting tricks, maybe a little more melodramatic. Occasionally, it's men who ignite Rivers' passion. Chief among them is the poet Frank O'Hara, who charms everyone he meets. Rivers first meets O'Hara in 1950 at a party hosted by John Ashbery. He writes that he and O'Hara talked our heads off for 2 hours before finding a quiet spot behind a drape to kiss. As a love affair, it's intense, but nothing is meant to last in this crowd. Their friendship will endure, however, and Rivers and O'Hara will collaborate, as shown here, on a dialogue of images and words called Stones, just as O'Hara will later join forces with Grace Hardigan and Kenneth Koch in similar collaborations. After returning from Europe with new heroes, including Gustave Courbet, Rivers starts work on his most ambitious painting to date, The Burial, seen here. Moved by the recent funeral of his grandmother, he chooses a dark palette for a graveside scene, taking his inspiration from an 1849 Courbet painting of a similar scene. The painting is exhibited in 1951 at the Tibor de Nage Gallery, New York's premier showcase for emerging artists, where gallery director John Bernard Myers is not only wild about the painting, he falls wildly in love with the painter. Burial is enthusiastically reviewed by the critics. One critic hails it as bleeding with compassion and bursting with bravura. Another approvingly calls it realism expressed in the abstract manner of today. When The Burial is later purchased by a foundation and donated to the Fort Wayne University Museum of Art in Indiana, it's Rivers' first institutional acquisition. Myers, seen here in his gallery, plays an important role in advancing Rivers' career, which the artist freely admits. He broadens Rivers' cultural horizons and introduces him to such literary lions as Tennessee Williams and W.H. Auden. Myers is remarkably astute in choosing which artists to show, having a sharp eye for talent and a deep understanding of art world currents and undercurrents. The relationship with Rivers endures for years, mostly to Rivers' advantage, but when Rivers decides to leave Thibaut Denage for an exclusive arrangement with the more prestigious gallery, the Marburg Gallery, Myers flies into a rage, screaming, "I'm going to destroy you." He doesn't, and eventually a manageable friendship rises out of the ruins. Around this time, Rivers is expanding his circle of artists and poets who become lifelong friends. He's introduced to the lively scene on the east end of Long Island, where many of those friends are finding refuge from the city. He's the one in the hat. He spends a couple of summers in rental cottages, sharing at first with Freilacher, Nell Blaine, Kenneth Koch, and John Ashbery. In 1956, he buys the house on Little Plains Road, a miracle wrought by his biggest fan, John Bernard Myers. It was Myers, writes Rivers, who got James Merrill, poet son of Merrill Lynch partner Charles, to put up the down payment on the house, which he buys for $10,500. Monthly mortgage payments are just $54.11. With more room for his offbeat family and his art, he begins to make plaster sculpture. And having received his degree in art education in 1951, he's able to teach now and then for a paycheck to help cover the family's expenses. Game for anything and always in need of money, he designed sets for O'Hara's play, Try, Try, and at one point was not too proud to work as a caricaturist on weekends at the pen counter in Bloomingdale's. This is Rivers' self figure from 1953. From 1953 to 1957, Rivers lives full-time in Southampton, where he's developing the style of painterly realism for which he's known, mingling drawing with patches of color against an ambiguous ground. As he later explained, I wanted to get away from it all, to do my painting more seriously without any of the interruptions of the city. It's a rare period of relative calm when he reportedly reads 21 novels, Balzac, Stendhal, and all the Russians, though he also finds time to appear in his friend Rudy Burkhart's film, A Day in the Life of a Cleaning Woman. This is, he's also working on Washington crossing the Delaware, seen here, which is generally considered his breakthrough painting. An effort of mixed sincerity and ironic inspiration is the way the critic Sam Hunter describes Rivers' remake of Emanuel Leitz's grandiose 1851 version of the heroic crossing. Rivers himself credits his reading of War and Peace as inspiration and unabashedly claims that he set out to paint the most controversial painting of our time. It was intended to take his style of painting, charcoal drawing and rag wiping, to a new height, he said, adding, "The mixture of grand art and absurdity was with me from the beginning." To find out what Washington's men might have been wearing when they crossed the river, he did some research at the Rogers Memorial Library, where he found what he needed in the children's section in books lavishly illustrated with revolutionary uniforms and equipment. The critics are mixed, but predictably, the painting outrages some avant-garde sensibilities at a time when abstract expressionism is dominant. For the pretentious high culture art establishment of the time, mockery is the worst offense. Rivers is crushed by attacks from his peers, but there will be no more lame attempts at self-annihilation. He exhibits his sculptures, and he collaborates with O'Hara on play, and he's included in several important group exhibits. Fairfield Porter, a sympathetic and respected guru of those with a figurative bent, gives Rivers the use of the barn behind his house in Southampton to work on large-scale paintings. There will be no more challenges to Rivers' position as an influential person after Washington crosses the Delaware. In 1957, when Rivers has no more than $1,000 in the bank, he's invited to be a contestant in the very popular TV show, the $64,000 Challenge. Several different versions of the strange episode have floated around, but in Rivers' own account, he's visited in Southampton by the show's sponsors, grilled on his personal life, presumably to assure he won't go off the rails on national TV, and soon finds himself on the set, seen here, with his competitor, a jockey who happens to be an expert on modern art. After a few easy questions, he begins studying seriously, realizing that he has a chance to win. He admits to getting pushy with the producers, pressuring them for hints on what areas he should be studying for the next challenge. He also acknowledges benefiting from a kindly librarian who's familiar with what the panelists who are composing the questions are reading. The tip helps Rivers to answer the $64,000 question correctly. Though unfortunately for him, the jockey also knows the answer, and each contestant is awarded $32,000. There being no TV in the Rivers Southampton home, Bertie and the boys have been watching over at the Polish Hall, where they explode in wild whoops and applause at Rivers' triumph. The $32,000 windfall is cause for celebration, but 1957 is also the year Bertie dies at the age of 66. As she starts to fail, Rivers is tender and attentive, and when she dies, she seems irreplaceable until Rivers hires Clarice Price to manage the household and fill the void. Clarice, a former teacher of music and art in London, is everything Bertie was not: beautiful, voluptuous, highly intelligent, funny, and game for whatever's happening. Rivers is smitten, and they're married in London in 1961, and here they are on their wedding day. For the next 6 years, Clarice will provide a stable, if still somewhat chaotic, home life in Southampton, where they are here, and in New York, where Rivers has resumed spending winters. She'll also serve frequently as Rivers' model, give birth to 2 daughters, and become a popular member of the lively circle of artists and poets summering on the East End. Rivers, always flirtatious, will have 2 more lasting relationships in the years following his separation from Clarice. He and the artist Daria Deshuk will live together for a decade, have a son, and remain friends for life. The last 5 years of his life will be spent with the poet Jenny Olin. From 1960 on, honors and accolades accumulate, though Rivers is not consistently prosperous. "I wasn't always rich and admired," he claims in his book, I had an uncomfortably long period from the late 60s to the mid 70s of continued glitter but little gold. He follows his historical subjects with paintings that appropriate and incorporate images from popular culture, such as cigarette packs seen here and banknotes, as well as family photographs. Some critics claim that because he chooses to paint everyday items, he's a forerunner or even the father of pop art, although others point to significant differences in approach and style. In 1969, Rivers accepts a commission from the Smith Haven Mall for its 40 feet of fashion display. He creates a pair of 16-foot tall fiberglass legs that have a controversial afterlife when they leave the mall. When the display is dismantled after 15 years, Rivers salvages the legs and brings them to his house in Southampton. In 1994, a second set is cast, and that's what we see here, from the original and purchased by a collector. Back in Southampton, the originals are positioned by Rivers at the entrance to his studio on Little Plains Road. And they required there that anyone entering the studio walk between the legs. There was some grumbling from neighbors, but they remain there until Rivers' death. Meanwhile, the second set is purchased by gallerist Ruth Farrad at auction and placed on her Sag Harbor lawn, causing some Sag Harborites to grumble, so that they are eventually removed. Only last summer at the Southampton Art Center's outdoor exhibition, Whimsy, do the original legs find a truly appreciative audience. At the end of the exhibit, the legs are purchased by a private collector. So there you see them on the left at SAC and in their new home on the right. In 2002, the same year, he's given a major retrospective at the Corcoran Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. Rivers is diagnosed with liver cancer. He dies at his home in Southampton in August and is buried in the Sag Harbor Independent Jewish Cemetery. Over the years, his work was exhibited in 42 one-man shows from New York to Tokyo, and he's represented in every museum in New York City that's major, and in many other important museums throughout the country and abroad. Few would dispute his David Levy's prediction that Rivers will be regarded as one of the truly influential painters of the second half of this 20th century. And that is where I conclude, and goes back to Connor.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, thank you. That was great. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them again in either the Q&A function or in the chat below, and we will go through them and see what we got. So we have one question right now. Do you have contact information for the Larry Rivers Archives, Scrolled or Foundation in New York City? Larry had produced a movie in 1966 that never screened. This person met Larry on the set, which was an all-night affair on a Governor's Island ferry boat that Larry had secured for the night.
Ah, very interesting. I believe that we do have some contact information for the foundation, right, Connor?
Yeah. The Larry Rivers Foundation, I believe they have contact information on their website. And if somebody is from there now, they want to put it in the chat for everybody to see a proper email to send to, that'd be fantastic. Otherwise, yeah, contacting the Larry Rivers Foundation via their website would probably be the best bet. They might have maybe the footage of it. Let's see, a few people saying great talk. Somebody asking, did Rivers ever meet Pollock?
Yes, I believe, I'm sure he did. I don't know the details. I think they met.
It would make sense. Let's see. Is this recorded for future viewing? Yes, it is. So we are recording this and it'll be up on YouTube next week on Tuesday. So if you're watching this in the future, hello, how are you? And please feel free to send around to any friends that you might have. And yes, actually we have here, somebody put information about the Larry Rivers Foundation. His name is David Joel, and his contact is right there. It's larryriversart@aol.com. So if you have any questions about his art, anything you might have, feel free to, I guess, shoot him an email and hopefully he can provide an answer for you. Let's see, a question from somebody. Does Rivers participate with the Jewish community?
I don't know of any specific incidents where he of course, I'm not sure about that. I think he was known in the Jewish community, and he's buried in the Jewish cemetery, so he had links.
Okay. We have why does he often leave one eye undone in his painting?
I wish I knew. Anybody with an answer to that? It just turns up so frequently. And even in this, his one eye is kind of blacked out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This writer said, I purchased one of his self-portraits, and it was in his last exhibition as he was dying. He didn't sign it. How can they get it appraised? I would suggest contacting maybe the Larry Rivers Foundation. They might have good information about that.
Yeah.
So they're also asking, has his value diminished as a painter? He was pleased. I had bought it a fellow local painter. So do you know if his value is diminished or?
I don't think so, but I really have no information on how his paintings are faring these days.
Let's see. So I mean, we do know that when the legs sold at the Arch Fair last year from SAC, they reported sold for $100,000. So at least some of his works are still fairly expensive.
Indicates he's still very esteemed.
David Joel from the Larry Rivers Foundation said in the chat that he has mixed links with the Jewish community. In the 50s, he was commissioned to do art for a temple, and the Jewish Museum has some of their those works, but the temple rejected the works. So he did do some paintings for local Jewish areas, and some of it is housed at the Jewish Museum. Another question. What was Rivers' relationship with his children like?
Well, his daughters were very upset about that film, so relations there weren't good. I'm not. I think he was a very complex person, and he really was in his way, a very good father. I mean, I think his sons were fond of him, and he wanted them when they split up, and he was very responsible, in many ways, and then dropped the ball in another way.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody else was asking if his behavior with his daughters hurt his value as an artist, which I think maybe is difficult for us to assess, whether that intrinsically hurt his value or not. But it definitely casts a negative shadow on his life and his career. Right.
It's always a question, between the person and the art, can you admire one without the other?
Yeah. Let's see. It doesn't look like we have any other questions in right now. If anybody has any last questions or burning desires, please feel free to submit them.
And if anybody knows why he always blacks out an eye, let me know.
Yeah, I would guess from trying to learn how to draw when I was younger, it was always hard to get that second eye to look right. So maybe he struggled with the same thing. But yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this great talk. Mary, I want to thank you for providing all the information and research. Oh, okay, we see here. So David Joel said, I do know why he blacks out an eye, and Connor is onto it to a degree. So okay, a little close there. But yes, I want to encourage everybody, if you have any questions or anything like that, please feel to reach out to us. We'll do the best we can, provide any information. And we also might pass you along to David Joel at the Larry Rivers Foundation to get a little bit more clarification. But thank you again for joining us. Make sure to check out our website, southamptonhistory.org, for any of our future programs that we have coming up. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.